The Arctic doesn't decide who survives right away. First, it waits to see who gives up. At minus 71 degrees Fahrenheit, the frozen ocean north of Alaska looked less like water and more like another planet. The horizon had disappeared hours ago beneath walls of white wind, and the sea ice stretched endlessly in every direction like shattered glass floating on black water. Somewhere inside that storm, Ethan Walker gripped the frozen railing of his fishing trawler and tried to steady his breathing. The boat groaned beneath him as another wave slammed into the hull. Ice covered everything now. The deck, the ropes, even the navigation lights had frozen into dull blue ghosts behind layers of frost. Ethan had worked these waters for almost 20 years, long enough to know the Arctic didn't care how experienced you were. Out here, one mistake could erase a man without leaving behind a single trace. The radio had gone dead nearly 40 minutes earlier. Then the engine failed. And after that, the silence began. Not normal silence. Arctic silence. The kind that made the world feel abandoned. Ethan pulled his coat tighter as freezing wind tore across the deck at nearly 60 miles per hour. Every breath stabbed his lungs. Snow gathered on his beard and eyelashes until blinking became difficult. Somewhere deeper inside the ship, metal screamed again. The sound echoed through the storm like the boat itself was warning him it wouldn't last much longer. "Come on," Ethan whispered through chattering teeth as he forced himself toward the emergency flare box near the stern. But the moment he reached it, the ice beneath his boots cracked violently. He froze. Another crack followed. Then another. The frozen surface surrounding the trawler was breaking apart. Huge fractures raced across the sea ice faster than he could process them. The storm had shifted the pressure beneath the frozen ocean, and now entire sheets of ice were separating in the dark water below. Ethan looked out into the white chaos and felt something colder than fear settle into his chest. The Arctic was moving. Suddenly, the trawler lurched sideways with enough force to throw him against the railing. A deafening snap exploded beneath the hull. Ethan barely had time to react before the ice under the ship split open completely. Water surged upward through the fracture. The boat tilted hard. Crates slid across the deck. One smashed into the rail beside him and disappeared into the freezing black water below. Ethan grabbed the flare gun just before another violent shift threw him off balance entirely. Then the world disappeared. The freezing ocean swallowed him whole. The cold hit like electricity. Ethan's body locked instantly as black water closed over his head. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The Arctic didn't feel cold anymore. It felt empty. Somewhere above him, blurred light twisted through moving ice as currents dragged him deeper beneath the surface. Panic exploded through his chest. He kicked blindly upward until his gloved hands finally slammed against solid ice. No opening, just frozen white above him. His lungs burned. He moved sideways desperately beneath the ice sheet until suddenly his hand broke through slush near a narrow crack. Ethan forced himself upward with the last strength he had left and collapsed onto floating ice, coughing seawater into the storm. The trawler was gone. Completely gone. No lights. No sound. Just endless white wind and shattered ice drifting through darkness. Ethan rolled onto his back, gasping for air as snow buried itself against his coat. His hands were already losing feeling. His left leg burned from the freezing water trapped inside his boot. He tried reaching for the emergency radio clipped to his jacket, but the screen remained black. Dead. Everything was dead. The storm swallowed the horizon so completely it felt like the world ended only a few feet away from him. Ethan slowly pushed himself upright on the drifting slab of ice beneath him. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet across. Barely enough space to stand. Around him, massive sheets of frozen ocean shifted and groaned like living things in the dark. Then he heard it. A deep sound beneath the ice. Low. Distant. Almost like a voice calling through water. Ethan stopped breathing. The sound came again. Closer this time. Something enormous moved beneath the frozen surface below him. And then, through a crack in the ice only 20 feet away, a black shape passed silently underneath. The shape beneath the ice moved with impossible smoothness, gliding through black water like it belonged to another world entirely. Ethan stared at the crack in the frozen surface as snow whipped across his face hard enough to sting his skin. For a moment, he convinced himself the storm was distorting his vision. But then the sound came again. Low. Deep. Almost musical. The ice beneath him vibrated softly. Something huge was circling below. Ethan slowly backed away from the fracture, his boots slipping against the frozen surface. Every survival instinct, he had screamed the same thing. Predator. His breathing grew shallow as another dark shadow appeared under the ice, larger this time, moving directly beneath the slab where he stood. The drifting platform shifted under his weight and tilted toward the open water. Ethan dropped to one knee instantly to steady himself. The freezing wind had already started cutting through the layers of his soaked clothes. His hands no longer felt human. They felt stiff and distant, like they belonged to someone else. He looked around desperately for anything useful. No supplies, no rope, no flare signal strong enough to punch through this storm. Just endless frozen ocean and the sounds beneath him getting closer. Then the ice cracked again. A sharp line split across the slab only a few feet from his boots. Ethan froze. Black water bubbled upward through the fracture as the floating ice separated slightly down the middle. His heart slammed against his ribs. Another crack followed, louder this time. The slab was breaking apart beneath him. Ethan forced himself to move, crawling toward the wider side of the ice while trying to distribute his weight evenly. But the storm had become stronger now. Wind tore across the ocean in violent bursts that pushed snow sideways like white smoke. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. He could barely see 20 feet ahead, and somewhere underneath him, the shadows kept moving. Suddenly, a massive black fin surfaced through the open water beside the ice. Ethan jerked backward, instinctively, nearly slipping into the freezing ocean again. The creature rose silently from beneath the surface, larger than anything he had ever seen this close before. An orca. Its skin looked almost unreal against the white storm, smooth black and white patterns cutting through the dark water like living ice. Ethan's chest tightened. He had seen orcas before from fishing boats, always at a distance. But this was different. This one was close enough that he could see frost collecting along the edge of its dorsal fin. The animal did not thrash or lunge. It simply floated there beside the ice, watching him. Ethan held his breath. The orca's dark eye remained fixed on him without moving. Snow settled across Ethan's shoulders while the freezing ocean groaned around them. Then another fin appeared farther back in the storm. Then another. A pod. Ethan's stomach dropped. He was surrounded. The slab beneath him shifted again as the current pulled it sideways between larger ice formations. Ethan looked over his shoulder and saw something worse than the orcas. Ahead of him, the frozen ocean suddenly ended in darkness. Open water stretched across a widening channel where the ice had completely broken apart. The current was tearing the frozen sheets away from each other faster now. His drifting slab was moving directly toward the gap. Ethan tried forcing himself to stand, but his left leg buckled underneath him from the cold trapped inside his boot. Pain shot upward instantly. He collapsed back onto the ice with a sharp breath. His body was shutting down. He knew the signs. Confusion, slower reactions, numbness spreading through his hands and face. Hypothermia had started. The storm became strangely quieter for a moment, like the Arctic itself was holding its breath. Then the orca beside him moved. Its enormous body slid closer to the ice until Ethan could hear water rolling against its skin. The animal tilted slightly beneath the surface. And then, with one slow, powerful motion, it pushed against the edge of the drifting slab. Ethan felt the entire platform shift sideways beneath him. He frowned in confusion. The orca pushed again. The slab rotated slightly away from the widening channel ahead. Ethan stared at the animal, unable to process what he was seeing. Another orca appeared on the opposite side and pressed its body against the ice too. Together they began guiding the drifting slab through the frozen maze around them. Ethan's breathing slowed as disbelief replaced panic. The pod was not hunting him. They were moving him. Then somewhere far out in the white storm ahead, a deep cry echoed across the Arctic water, and every orca in the pod suddenly stopped moving at once. The cry rolled across the frozen ocean like something ancient buried beneath the storm. Every orca around Ethan became perfectly still. Even the water seemed to stop moving for a second. Ethan lifted his head slowly, trying to locate where the sound had come from, but the blizzard swallowed everything beyond a wall of white snow and darkness. Then the cry came again, higher this time, desperate. Not the deep call of the larger whales surrounding him, but something smaller, younger. Ethan felt the pod shift around him immediately. The two orcas beside the ice moved first, turning sharply toward the sound somewhere deeper in the storm. Water surged against the frozen slab beneath him as the current carried him forward between massive, drifting sheets of ice. Ethan swallowed hard and forced himself upright on his shaking legs. The cold had become unbearable now. Every part of his body hurt in strange, disconnected waves. His soaked clothes had frozen stiff against his skin, and each breath felt thinner than the last. He looked down at his hands and barely recognized them beneath the layers of frost and pale skin. But even through the pain, he could not stop staring at the animals surrounding him. There were at least 6 of them now moving silently through the fractured Arctic water. Giant shadows beneath the ice. Guardians guiding his drifting platform through a maze of frozen destruction. Ethan tried making sense of it, but his exhausted mind kept failing. Orcas did not behave like this. Wild predators did not rescue stranded fishermen in the middle of nowhere. Another violent gust of wind tore across the ocean and nearly knocked him off balance. Ethan dropped back to one knee as snow blasted sideways through the darkness. The slab beneath him scraped against another sheet of ice with a deep, grinding sound. Ahead, huge frozen ridges rose out of the ocean like shattered mountains. The current between them narrowed dangerously. Ethan realized the drifting slab was being funneled directly into the frozen passage. Then one of the orcas surfaced beside him again, close enough now that Ethan could hear its breath explode into the freezing air. Warm mist rose from the blowhole before instantly vanishing into the storm. The animal looked enormous at this distance, larger than the side of a pickup truck. Its black eye remained fixed on Ethan for a brief moment before it turned back toward the narrow channel ahead. Then it dove beneath the surface again. Ethan looked up just in time to see why. The ice passage ahead was collapsing. Huge chunks of frozen sea were shifting together under the pressure of the storm. The opening was closing fast. Ethan's drifting slab was heading straight toward it. His pulse surged instantly. If the ice trapped him between those ridges, the slab would shatter apart completely. He tried paddling weakly with his hands against the frozen surface, but his strength was fading too quickly now. He could barely feel his arms. The current pulled him closer. 20 feet. 15. 10. The walls of ice groaned louder as enormous cracks spread across them like lightning. Ethan braced himself. Then suddenly the water beneath him erupted with movement. 3 orcas surged upward together beneath the drifting slab. Ethan gasped as the entire platform lifted slightly from the force below. The whales pushed against the ice with slow coordinated power, forcing the slab sideways just as the frozen passage collapsed shut behind him with a thunderous crack. Ice exploded across the water where he would have been seconds earlier. Ethan stared back in shock. The orcas had anticipated it. They had known the ice was about to close. The realization unsettled him more than the storm itself. Another cry echoed across the Arctic darkness. Closer now. Ethan turned toward the sound and finally saw movement ahead through the snow. A small black shape struggled near a broken section of ice about 50 yards away. One of the larger orcas surfaced immediately beside it, circling in agitation. Ethan narrowed his eyes through the blizzard and slowly understood what he was seeing. A calf. The young orca was trapped beneath fractured ice, too small for it to break through completely. Its movements grew weaker each time it surfaced for air through the narrow gaps. The adults around it moved urgently through the water, but none could reach the calf without risking crushing it beneath the shifting ice. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest as another weak cry drifted through the storm. The drifting slab carrying him moved closer toward the trapped calf. One of the adult orcas surfaced directly beside Ethan again and stared at him with unsettling focus. Snow gathered across Ethan's shoulders as freezing wind screamed around them. Then the whale slowly turned its head toward the trapped calf before looking back at him again. Ethan's breathing slowed. The animal was not just watching him anymore. It was asking him for something. For a few seconds, Ethan could only stare at the massive animal beside the ice. Snow spiraled through the darkness between them while freezing wind screamed across the Arctic water, but the orca did not look away. Its eye remained fixed on him with a strange calmness that felt impossible in the middle of such chaos. Then the trapped calf cried again beneath the broken ice ahead. The sound cut through the storm like something frightened and exhausted. Ethan looked toward the smaller shape struggling in the narrow opening. The calf surfaced briefly, releasing a weak breath before slipping beneath the freezing water again. Ice shifted above it immediately. The gap was getting smaller. Ethan swallowed hard. His entire body trembled uncontrollably now. Every instinct told him to stay where he was, to conserve what little strength he had left. Hypothermia was already clouding his thoughts. He could barely stand without dizziness crushing over him in waves. But when he looked back at the adult orca beside him, something about the animal's stillness unsettled him more than fear itself. It was waiting. Another crack thundered across the frozen surface nearby. Ethan flinched as huge slabs of sea ice collided together in the current. The drifting platform beneath him jolted sideways violently. He realized the storm was worsening again. Snow thickened until the world shrank into shadows and moving white fog. The trapped calf surfaced once more, this time struggling harder against the fractured ice surrounding it. Ethan forced himself to move. Slowly he crawled across the slab toward the edge nearest the calf. The freezing wind stabbed through his soaked clothes with every movement. His hands burned painfully as he gripped the rough ice for balance. One wrong shift in weight could break the slab apart entirely. The pod followed him silently through the water. Ethan reached the edge and looked down into the black ocean below. The calf floated beneath a thick layer of fractured ice, no more than 2 feet below the surface. It was larger than he expected, maybe 10 feet long already, but still trapped between slabs too narrow for it to escape cleanly. Every time it tried pushing upward, the ice shifted dangerously around its body. Ethan looked around desperately for anything useful. Then he spotted it. A broken metal pole frozen halfway into the drifting slab behind him. Probably debris from the trawler wreck carried here by the current. Ethan crawled toward it and pulled with numb hands until the pole finally came loose from the ice with a sharp crack. The movement nearly sent him collapsing sideways from exhaustion. His breathing had become shallow now. Slow. Dangerous. He could feel sleep creeping into the edges of his mind, the kind Arctic fishermen feared most. The cold did not kill quickly out here. First it convinced you to stop fighting. Ethan forced himself back toward the trapped calf. The adult orcas circled quietly nearby, their dark fins cutting through the water like moving shadows. None of them interfered. They simply watched him. Ethan reached the narrow opening above the calf and carefully lowered the metal pole into the fractured ice. His first strike barely chipped the frozen surface. The ice was thicker than he expected. Ethan cursed under his breath and hit it again harder. Pain exploded through his frozen fingers from the impact. The calf cried beneath him and twisted weakly against the ice. Ethan kept striking. Again. Small cracks spread outward through the frozen layer. The current beneath the ice shifted violently around him, rocking the drifting slab side to side. One of the larger orcas surfaced suddenly beside him close enough that freezing seawater splashed across Ethan's coat. He looked over instinctively and froze. The animal was positioned directly against the edge of the slab, holding it steady in the moving current while he worked. Ethan stared in disbelief for half a second before another crack beneath the calf snapped him back to focus. He raised the pole again with shaking arms and slammed it downward. This time the fractured ice finally gave way. A larger opening split across the surface with a sharp, echoing crack. Immediately the calf surged upward through the gap, releasing a loud breath into the freezing air. Water exploded outward across the ice around Ethan. He lost balance instantly. The slab tilted beneath him as his boots slipped against the frozen surface. Ethan dropped the metal pole and slid toward the open water. For one terrifying second, he felt nothing beneath him except darkness and freezing ocean. Then something enormous rose beneath the edge of the slab and stopped his fall completely. Ethan looked down in shock. One of the adult orcas had positioned itself directly underneath him, keeping him from sliding into the water. The whale remained perfectly still despite the crushing current around it. Snow swirled across Ethan's face as he struggled back on his solid ice, breathing hard. Around him, the pod suddenly erupted with movement. Deep calls echoed through the Arctic storm as the freed calf surfaced beside the adults at last. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Ethan realized the orcas were not just guiding him through the storm anymore. They were keeping him alive. The storm should have killed Ethan hours ago, but somehow the frozen ocean kept carrying him forward. Snow roared sideways across the Arctic darkness while the drifting slab moved steadily between fields of shattered ice, guided by shadows beneath the water. Ethan remained on his knees near the edge, breathing slowly through trembling lips as the pod circled around him in complete silence. The rescued calf stayed close beside the larger orcas now, surfacing every few moments through narrow openings in the ice. Each time it released a breath into the freezing air, Ethan felt an almost unreal sense of relief settle into his chest. The animal was alive, and somehow, against every law of nature he thought he understood, so was he. But survival in the Arctic never stayed simple for long. Another wave struck the drifting ice from beneath, jolting Ethan sideways hard enough to nearly throw him back into the water. He grabbed the frozen surface with numb hands and looked ahead. The ocean had changed again. Massive walls of pressure ice rose through the storm like frozen cliffs, some taller than houses, packed tightly together by the shifting current. The narrow path the orcas had guided him through was disappearing. Ethan forced himself upright slowly. His legs barely responded now. Hypothermia had settled deep into his body, turning every movement heavy and delayed. He knew enough about cold water survival to recognize the danger. First came pain, then numbness, then confusion. After that, people simply stopped trying to live. Ethan looked toward the nearest orca as it surfaced beside the slab again. Warm mist exploded from its blowhole before vanishing instantly into the white air. The animal stayed beside him for several seconds, almost matching the speed of the drifting ice perfectly. Ethan stared down at the dark eye watching him and felt something unsettling grow inside him. Trust. It made no sense, but somewhere between the collapsing ice and the trapped calf, fear had started changing into something else. Another deep cry echoed through the storm ahead. This time the pod reacted instantly. The adults surged forward beneath the water, moving faster now. Ethan frowned. Something was wrong. The drifting slab entered the frozen passage between the towering ice ridges just as the current became violent beneath him. Water churned black between the walls of ice, pulling chunks of frozen ocean together with terrifying force. Ethan heard deep cracking sounds echo through the storm above him. Then he saw it. A pressure ridge ahead was collapsing directly into the narrow channel. Huge slabs of ice tilted downward into the water one after another, sealing the path shut. Ethan's pulse spiked. The current was carrying him straight toward it. He tried pushing against the slab with his boots, desperate to slow himself down, but his body had almost no strength left. The drifting ice accelerated through the narrow channel. The closing ridge loomed larger ahead. Ethan could hear ice grinding against ice with a sound like mountains breaking apart. Then suddenly the pod moved around him in perfect coordination. Two orcas surged ahead while the others circled behind the slab. Ethan barely had time to react before powerful waves rolled beneath the ice. The slab shifted sharply sideways as the whales began forcing it toward a narrow opening between the collapsing ridges. The gap looked impossibly tight. Ethan stared in disbelief as the orcas pushed harder beneath the current. The drifting slab scraped violently against frozen walls on both sides, while chunks of ice crashed into the water around him. Snow exploded into the air. Ethan dropped flat against the slab as another shockwave rolled through the passage. One wrong movement now would flip him directly into the freezing ocean. The opening narrowed further ahead. Too narrow. Ethan saw it instantly. The slab would never fit through. His breathing stopped. Then one of the larger orcas surfaced directly beside the ice and slammed its body against the frozen edge with incredible force. The slab cracked loudly down the middle. Ethan grabbed the surface instinctively as half the ice broke away into the current. For one terrifying moment, he thought the whale had doomed him. But then he realized what it had done. The slab was smaller now, small enough to fit through the collapsing gap. Ethan stared at the animal in shock as the current pulled him forward again. The remaining piece of ice slid through the narrowing opening only seconds before the ridge. Sealed shut behind him completely with a thunderous crash. Water surged violently outward from the impact, rocking the slab beneath him. Ethan collapsed onto the frozen surface, breathing hard, while snow buried itself against his coat. Behind him, the Arctic passage disappeared beneath tons of shifting ice. No human could have navigated through that alive. Ethan slowly lifted his head toward the pod surrounding him. The whales moved silently through the storm once more, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Then, far ahead through the white darkness, Ethan saw something he thought the Arctic had already taken from him forever. A distant orange light flickering weakly beyond the storm. At first, Ethan thought the orange light was another trick of the storm. The Arctic had a way of distorting distance until hope itself became dangerous. But as the drifting slab carried him farther through the frozen passage, the light flickered again through the snow. Small, weak, but real. Ethan narrowed his eyes against the wind and slowly realized what he was seeing. A structure. Somewhere ahead beyond the shattered ridges of ice, something stood against the darkness. His pulse quickened painfully beneath the numbness spreading through his body. Shelter. Maybe an emergency research station. Maybe an abandoned fishing cabin. He did not care anymore. Anything with walls could mean survival. The pod moved faster around him now, cutting through the black water with smooth, controlled movements. The calf remained close beside the adults, surfacing more confidently after its rescue. Ethan watched them through half-frozen eyelashes, still struggling to understand why these animals had not abandoned him already. The storm intensified again overhead. Snow poured across the ocean in endless waves, swallowing the sky completely. Ethan could barely feel his legs now. He looked down and realized ice had formed around the lower half of his coat, where seawater had frozen solid against the fabric. Every breath came slower. Heavy. Somewhere deep inside himself, he felt exhaustion beginning to overpower fear. That was the real danger. Arctic fishermen talked about it quietly whenever someone vanished in the cold. The moment when survival stopped feeling important. Ethan shook his head hard, forcing himself awake. The distant light flickered once more between walls of drifting ice. Closer now. Then the current beneath him suddenly changed. The slab jerked violently sideways. Ethan nearly slipped off the edge before catching himself against the frozen surface. Water churned black beneath him with growing force. One of the larger orcas surfaced immediately beside the slab, releasing a sharp breath into the freezing air. The animal sounded agitated for the first time since Ethan encountered the pod. Then he heard it too. A low roaring sound somewhere ahead beneath the storm. Ethan looked forward carefully and felt his stomach tighten. The ocean ice ended abruptly less than 100 yards ahead. Beyond it, dark open water crashed violently between towering frozen ridges. Massive waves rolled through the narrow channel like a river cutting through ice. The current feeding into it was accelerating fast. Ethan understood immediately what had happened. The storm had opened part of the sea ice into a moving channel of freezing water, and the slab carrying him was drifting directly toward it. If he entered that current on a piece of broken ice this small, he would not survive more than minutes. Ethan forced himself onto his knees and tried digging his boots into the frozen surface to slow the drift, but the slab only spun harder beneath him. The current was too strong now. The pods circled rapidly around him, their movements no longer calm and controlled. Deep calls echoed beneath the water as the orcas moved alongside the slab in coordinated bursts. Ethan looked again toward the distant orange light. It was there. He could see it clearly, now resting somewhere beyond the open water ahead. So close, but unreachable. Then the slab struck something beneath the surface. Ethan pitched forward hard against the ice as a loud crack split through the frozen platform underneath him. He froze. Another crack followed instantly. The slab was breaking apart again. Water surged upward through widening fractures near his knees. Ethan's breathing became shallow. He looked around desperately as pieces of ice separated from the edges and vanished into the current. The slab would not stay together much longer. One of the orcas surfaced directly in front of him now, blocking the path toward the rushing channel ahead. The animal stared at Ethan for several seconds before diving beneath the surface again. Then suddenly the pod changed direction completely. Instead of following the current forward, the whales began pushing against the side of the slab together, forcing it sideways across the moving water. Ethan frowned in confusion. The light was ahead. Why were they turning away from it? Then he saw what the storm had hidden before. The orange glow was not stable. It flickered wildly now between the snow and darkness. Too unstable for a cabin lantern. Too high above the ice for a building window. Ethan's pulse slowed as realization settled over him. It was fire. A burning piece of wreckage trapped somewhere beyond the open channel. Not shelter, not rescue, just another illusion the Arctic had thrown into the storm. Ethan stared at the distant flames disappearing through snow and felt the last piece of certainty inside him collapse. He had been following false hope. The pod kept pushing the slab sideways away from the rushing water while the burning wreckage vanished deeper into the storm behind them. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Ethan understood something terrifying. The only reason he was still alive was because the orcas kept stopping him from making the wrong choice. The Arctic became strangely quiet after the burning wreck disappeared into the storm. Not silent, because the wind still screamed across the frozen ocean and the shifting ice still groaned beneath the current, but quieter in another way. Ethan stopped believing rescue was waiting somewhere ahead. The false light had taken the last piece of certainty he was holding on to, and now only exhaustion remained. He sat motionless on the shrinking slab of ice, while snow slowly buried itself across his shoulders and arms. The pod circled nearby in dark, silent arcs beneath the water. The calves surfaced beside the adults every few moments now, stronger than before, releasing small bursts of breath into the freezing air. Ethan watched them through heavy eyes and felt his thoughts beginning to drift apart. Tom no longer felt normal. Minutes stretched strangely inside the storm until he could not tell how long he had been floating through the darkness anymore. The cold had moved deeper into him now. His hands no longer hurt at all. That frightened him more than pain ever could. He remembered an older fisherman once describing hypothermia over coffee in a harbor diner years ago. First, the Arctic attacks your body. Then it attacks your mind. Eventually, it convinces you to rest. Ethan lowered his head slowly. Rest sounded good. Just for a minute. Just long enough to stop shaking. Then something struck the underside of the slab hard enough to jolt him awake instantly. Ethan looked up in confusion as another impact rolled beneath the ice. One of the larger orcas surfaced beside him again, releasing a sharp breath directly into the storm. The animal sounded urgent. Agitated. Ethan forced himself upright weakly and looked ahead through the blowing snow. At first he saw nothing except darkness. Then lightning flashed somewhere beyond the horizon. The entire Arctic Ocean illuminated for half a second in pale blue light. Ethan's stomach tightened immediately. A massive pressure wave was moving through the frozen sea ahead. Even from this distance, he could see the ice lifting and collapsing in uneven lines across the storm. The current beneath his slab accelerated sharply. Another flash of lightning lit the horizon again, and this time Ethan saw towering waves forming far beyond the broken ice fields. The storm was changing into something worse. The pod reacted instantly. The orcas began circling tighter around the slab, moving faster beneath the water than Ethan had seen before. Deep calls echoed around him through the frozen ocean. Coordinated. Purposeful. The calf stayed close between the adults as the current strengthened around them. Then the first wave reached the ice field. The frozen surface exploded into movement. Massive sheets of ice collided together with deafening force, while black water surged upward through widening cracks. Ethan lost balance immediately as the slab tilted violently sideways beneath him. He dropped flat against the frozen surface just before a surge of seawater crashed across the ice. The freezing water soaked through his coat again instantly. Ethan gasped sharply. His body could not survive much more cold. Another wave struck the ice field. Larger this time. The slab lifted almost completely out of the water before crashing back down between moving sheets of ice. Ethan's hands slipped across the frozen surface. He slid toward the edge helplessly as the slab rotated beneath him. The ocean below churned black and violent. Then suddenly something enormous rose beside him through the water. One of the adult orcas surfaced directly against the edge of the slab, pressing its body tightly against the ice to stop Ethan from sliding into the sea. Another wave crashed across the frozen channel. The slab split loudly beneath Ethan's chest. Cracks spread outward in every direction. He stared downward in horror as freezing water surged upward through the widening fractures. The ice would not survive another impact. Ethan tried crawling toward the center, but his arms barely responded anymore. Every movement felt distant and slow. The Arctic was winning. Another wave rolled toward them through the darkness ahead. Ethan saw it coming this time. Taller than the others. Strong enough to destroy what remained of the drifting slab completely. The pod moved instantly. Two orcas surged ahead into the path of the wave while the others tightened around Ethan. Then something impossible happened. As the wave crashed into the broken ice field, the adult orcas positioned themselves between the surge and Ethan's slab, absorbing the force of the water with their own bodies. The remaining wave that reached Ethan was weaker now, just enough to rock the slab violently instead of shattering it apart. Ethan stared in disbelief. The whales were shielding him. The calf surfaced briefly beside the slab during the chaos, crying softly through the storm. Ethan reached one numb hand toward it without thinking. The young orca stayed there for one strange, quiet second beside the ice, before diving beneath the surface again. Then the storm unleashed another deafening crack somewhere ahead, and Ethan looked up just in time to see the frozen ocean splitting open directly across their path. The frozen ocean split apart with a sound so deep it felt less like ice breaking and more like the earth itself opening beneath the storm. Ethan lifted his head weakly as a massive fracture tore across the water ahead, cutting through the shattered ice field in a jagged black line that stretched far beyond what he could see. The current beneath his slab surged violently toward the opening. Snow blasted sideways through the darkness while huge sections of frozen sea tilted and collapsed into the widening channel. Ethan stared at the black water ahead and understood immediately what would happen if the slab reached it. The current would drag him under the broken ice where no rescue team would ever find him. One of the larger orcas surfaced hard beside the slab, releasing a sharp breath into the freezing air. The pod tightened around Ethan instantly. Their movements no longer looked calm or graceful now. They looked desperate. Ethan tried forcing himself onto his elbows, but his body barely responded. The cold had reached too far inside him. His thoughts drifted strangely between clarity and confusion. At one point, he thought he heard voices somewhere inside the storm. Men from his old fishing crew laughing on the docks back in Kodiak. The smell of coffee. Harbor lights reflecting across calm water. Then the Arctic wind hit his face again and dragged him back into reality. Another wave rolled through the broken sea. The slab lurched forward directly toward the widening fracture. Ethan's pulse slowed with terrible calmness. He no longer had enough strength to panic. Around him, the pod moved rapidly beneath the water, but even they seemed unable to stop the current pulling everything toward the open channel ahead. The calf surfaced briefly beside Ethan once more, releasing a frightened cry before disappearing beneath the dark water again. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. The exhaustion felt endless now. Then a distant sound reached him through the storm. Faint at first. Rhythmic. Mechanical. Ethan's eyes opened slowly. He listened carefully through the screaming wind. The sound came again. Not thunder. Not shifting ice. Rotors. A helicopter. Ethan forced himself upright with the last strength he had left. Somewhere beyond the storm, hidden behind walls of snow and darkness, rescue crews were searching the Arctic ice fields. Hope surged through him so suddenly it almost hurt. Ethan grabbed for the emergency flare gun still clipped to his frozen coat. His numb fingers barely worked anymore. The metal felt welded to the holster beneath layers of ice. The rotor sound grew louder overhead, then faded again behind the storm. Ethan's breathing became frantic. "Come on," he whispered weakly through frozen lips. He finally tore the flare gun free just as another violent wave struck the slab sideways. Ethan nearly lost the flare into the ocean. The fracture ahead widened further. Black water churned violently beneath the shifting ice. The current accelerated again, pulling the slab directly toward the opening. Ethan raised the flare gun toward the sky with trembling hands and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. His chest tightened instantly. The flare had frozen. He hit the side of the gun desperately against the ice and tried again. Still nothing. Above him, the helicopter sound drifted farther away into the storm. Ethan lowered his head slowly. The Arctic had one final cruelty left after all. Then the pod reacted all at once. Deep calls echoed through the water beneath him as every orca surged toward the widening fracture ahead. Ethan looked up weakly just as the first whale slammed into a floating sheet of ice near the opening. The enormous slab shifted sideways in the current. Another orca struck from beneath. Then another. Ethan stared in disbelief as the pod began forcing huge chunks of broken ice together directly across the channel. The whales were building a barrier. The current slammed against the newly formed wall of ice and slowed enough for Ethan's drifting slab to veer sideways instead of plunging into the open water. But the pressure against the barrier became enormous immediately. Ice groaned loudly as waves crashed against it from the other side. One of the larger orcas remained wedged beneath the shifting slabs, holding the barrier together against the force of the storm. Ethan suddenly realized the whale was not moving anymore. The pressure ice had trapped part of its body beneath the frozen mass. Another helicopter sound cut through the blizzard overhead, louder now. Searchlights pierced briefly through the snow far above the Arctic water. Ethan lifted the flare gun again with shaking hands. One last attempt. He squeezed the trigger. This time the flare exploded upward into the storm in a burst of burning red light. The entire frozen ocean glowed crimson around him. Searchlights instantly shifted direction overhead. The helicopter had seen him. Ethan collapsed back onto the ice, breathing hard, while the red flare illuminated the pod below him. And through the storm and drifting snow, he saw the trapped orca still holding the ice barrier together even as the current crashed endlessly against it. The red flare burned through the Arctic storm like the final heartbeat of a dying fire. Snow and darkness glowed crimson across the shattered ice, while the helicopter searchlights turned sharply toward Ethan's drifting slab. For the first time since the trawler vanished beneath the frozen ocean, another human being knew he was still alive. Ethan lay motionless against the ice, barely able to lift his head anymore. The flare gun slipped from his frozen fingers and disappeared into the snow beside him. Above the storm, the helicopter circled lower through the white chaos. Searchlights swept across the broken sea until finally one beam locked directly onto Ethan and stayed there. The sudden brightness forced him to squint against the snow. Voices crackled faintly through the wind from somewhere overhead, distant and distorted by the storm. Rescue crews. Real. Not another illusion. Ethan tried to push himself upright, but collapsed back onto the slab immediately. His body had nothing left. Around him, the pod still moved through the dark water beneath the ice barrier they had created. The current slammed violently against the frozen wall while waves crashed endlessly into the shifting slabs. And still the trapped orca held its position beneath the pressure ice, keeping the barrier from breaking apart long enough for the rescue helicopter to reach him. Ethan turned his head slowly toward the water beside the slab. Through the moving cracks in the ice, he caught brief glimpses of the whale beneath the surface. The animal remained almost completely still despite the force of the storm around it. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest. None of this should have happened. The Arctic was not supposed to leave room for mercy. Yet somehow these creatures had carried him through a frozen nightmare that should have erased him hours ago. The helicopter lowered farther through the storm now, blades thundering above the ocean. A rescue cable dropped toward the drifting slab, swaying violently in the wind. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before forcing his numb hands to move again. Every motion felt slow and unreal. He barely managed to secure the harness around himself before the rescue crew began pulling him upward through the freezing snow. The slab drifted farther below him as he rose into the storm. Ethan looked down weakly at the frozen ocean beneath the helicopter lights. The pod circled below in dark, silent shapes around the broken ice barrier. The calf surfaced briefly beside the trapped adult before disappearing beneath the water again. Then Ethan saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the helicopter lifted him higher above the Arctic Sea, the trapped orca finally broke free from beneath the shifting ice. The barrier collapsed almost immediately afterward, swallowed by black water and crashing waves. But instead of leaving, the whale surfaced slowly beside the drifting remains of Ethan's slab and looked upward directly at him. Even through the snow and distance, Ethan could see the long white scar running across the side of its dorsal fin where the ice had trapped it. The animal stayed there watching the helicopter rise into the storm until the searchlights finally faded into the darkness above. 3 weeks later, Ethan sat alone beside the window of a recovery room in Anchorage while snow drifted quietly outside the hospital glass. Doctors called his survival impossible. Severe hypothermia. Hours exposed on Arctic ice. Most men would not have lasted half that long. Reporters wanted interviews. Scientists asked questions. Rescue crews tried mapping currents and storm patterns to explain how he had survived. Ethan answered almost none of them. because every explanation sounded smaller than what really happened out there. Sometimes late at night, he still heard the sounds from beneath the ice. The deep calls rolling through black Arctic water. The strange silence of the pod moving through the storm around him. But the part he remembered most clearly was the moment the orcas kept him from following the burning wreckage into the open channel. The moment they understood danger better than he did. Months later, after winter loosened its grip on the northern coast, Ethan returned to the harbor where his old fishing crew once worked the Bering Sea. The ocean looked calmer now beneath gray spring skies, almost ordinary again, almost harmless. Ethan stood alone at the edge of the dock for a long time without speaking. Then movement appeared far beyond the harbor mouth. A black dorsal fin surfaced slowly above the water. Then another beside it. Ethan's breathing stopped. The pod remained near the surface only briefly before turning back toward open ocean. But one whale lingered behind the others for a moment longer. Even from the dock, Ethan could see the pale scar crossing its dorsal fin beneath the cold northern light. The whale stayed there watching him silently across the water before finally disappearing beneath the surface again. And in that moment Ethan understood something: the Arctic had nearly frozen out of him forever. Sometimes survival does not come from fighting the wilderness. Sometimes it comes from realizing the wilderness has already chosen not to let you disappear.